Hi everyone, my name is Christine Sheza, and I did my research paper topic on Korean reunification. And since we weren't actually able to conduct our surveys this semester, I'm presenting my findings through different previous research on the subject. So before we actually get into any of the research and the sources, I want to introduce what we're gonna be talking about. So first, we're gonna be doing important background information. First, we're going to start with before 1945 and then after 1945, and then we're going to get into sources and then look at a conclusion based on the findings and research. So we're going to look at a little bit of background information on the Korean Peninsula and Korean history before we actually get into any of the sources. So first, way before 1953 in the Korean War, there was a number of dynasties, the last being the Joseon dynasty, that was started in around 1392 and it ended with the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1910. Japan was in Korea for a number of years between 1910 and 1945. However, they had committed a number of atrocities, and because of that, they were eventually kicked out of Korea at the end of World War II. So since they had this massive peninsula and country to kind of figure out what to do with, um, the United States and the Soviet Union ended up dividing the country into two, right along the 38th parallel here. And this ended up leading to the Korean War. So the Korean War was when it was started by North Korea invading to the south. And the North Koreans managed to push them all the way along here until they just had this little stretch of land left, which is modern day Busan, which is like a major coastal city in Korea. However, there was a turning point in the war, and I believe it was with the student army, and they ended up turning the tides. They then pushed the Soviet forces and North Korea all the way back up to right around here, which they just had. So North Korea just had this little sliver of land left, and unfortunately they weren't able to completely push them back because this is when Russia started, or the Soviet Union was helping them again, and they managed to push them back. So to the present day DMZ, the militarized zone, which is where the truce was set on July 26th of 1953. And because there has been no actual ending of the war, the Korean Peninsula, they're still in a armistice, so the war is still not technically over. Okay, so now we're going to look at a little bit of background information from after the Korean War. So when the two countries split, they made their own names. So South Korea is known as Daehanmin국, which is the Republic of Korea in South Korea, and then North Korea they call themselves Cho선민주주의 인민공화국, which is essentially Democratic People's Republic of Korea. However, if you notice, these two characters were the same as what was originally known as Choson. So North Korea still technically sees themselves as true Joseon, and they never separated. These two countries are more commonly known, in the Korean language, as Bukhan, meaning North Korea, and Namhan, meaning South Korea. So with North Korea, they received a lot of aid from the Soviet Union, and whereas South Korea aid from the United States. North Korea set up a dictatorship while South Korea was set up with a democracy. And there have been 3 dictators of North Korea since the Korean War and since its founding. Kim Il-sung was the first one, his son Kim Jong-il was second, and then the present day is Kim Jong-un. In Korea, there have been a number of presidents, the first being Lee Seung-man, and the current president is Yoon Suk-yeol. Yoon Suk-yeol was brought into government in May of this year. So one quick little important thing to point out is regarding the maps of North and South Korea, in North and South Korea versus outside of North and South Korea. So, since the war is technically not over, both countries still view themselves as one unit. So, if you're in North Korea, you see the entire peninsula as North Korean, South Korea, the entire peninsula as South Korean. Um, and then along with that, there is an interesting fact where if you are from North Korea or South Korea, it's extremely dangerous for you guys to go into North Korea because the North Korean government will see you as a North Korean citizen and they won't let you leave. And it's the same way North Korea, if they're able to enter into South Korea, they would immediately get passports and become South Korean citizens. So that's why a lot of people, when they do defect, will defect to South Korea versus to like Mongolia or some other countries down near Thailand and Vietnam in that area, because they would be considered refugees in those countries, whereas in South Korea they'd be considered South Korean citizens. So in the rest of the world, it's different though. We see them as two completely separate entities. Just a little interesting thing that is of note later on in the presentation. Okay, so now with the sources that I have. So first we're going to be looking at an economic roadmap to Korean reunification, the pitfalls and prospects by Brian J. Barna, just to get a kind of economic view of the whole situation. Then we'll be looking at a language split by the border, what division of the Korean language means for reunification by Lena Hammond. That's going to look at a lot about the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics and the forming of a unified women's hockey team and the language barrier with that. Then we're going to look at the Korean Peace Fund by Shepard Iverson, which is kind of like a way of incentivizing the reunification of North and South Korea to the North Koreans. Then one of the most important sources in this, the South Korean Youth Perception of North Korean Unification by Chi-yoon Kim, Kil-dong Kim, Chung-koo Kang, and Chung-koo Kang. That's going to look at, that has a lot of polling, and we're going to be looking at a number of charts from that source specifically in opinions on reunification in South Korea. And then the final one is Resettling in North Korea, Challenges for Young North Korean Refugees by Ji Yong-soo and Myung-hyun Go. So that's going to look at what I talked about earlier with the North Koreans coming into South Korea and what to expect when they get there. Okay, so the first source is An Economic Roadmap to Korean Reunification, Pitfalls and Prospects by Brian J. Barna. So the methods of conducting this study were studying history mainly, and then comparing the two Koreas, and then studying the Soviet Union's economic history, since the Soviet Union played a big role in North Korea's economy. So from that source, we found that South Korea was able to boost their economy, while North Korea was not. North Korea wasn't able to because they still follow the ways of the Soviet Union, so they're stuck in an economy that hasn't evolved to modern day. And the main challenge of reunification regarding the economy, South Korea would take a massive hit to their economy. So the main issue that most South Koreans have when it comes to the economic reasons is their country, while it's prosperous, like things like Samsung, Hyundai, all of those massive, big products, they're going to all take a hit because they have to help boost North Korea's economy and bring them into their country. So that is not a great thing that many South Koreans would want. They're enjoying this prosperity, like economic prosperity in their country, and it just wouldn't be a very big benefit. So a lot of young South Koreans don't really care all that much. They prefer just to stick with the booming economy versus having to take a massive hit. So the second source is A Language Split by the Border, what the division of the Korean language means for reunification by Lena Hammond. So the methods that this study was conducted through was research on current events, specifically the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. So, and then also they researched why the language changed. So, looking at the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, what ended up happening was North and South Korea decided to make a unified women's hockey team, ice hockey team. This in the books looked very nice, very good. However, there was a number of very talented ice hockey players that were cut from the South Korean team right before the Olympics, which caused backlash in South Korea um, because there was a number of North Koreans that got to take their place, even though they had worked for it for like their entire lives. Um, so with the findings, both so both speak Korean. Both North and South Korea speak Korean. However, North Korea has a different version than South Korea. It's like a dialect. So the North Korean dialect, they have a lot of Russian loanwords, and as of now, they're trying to remove all of the loanwords to purify the language. They're trying to get Korean back to what it used to be. Whereas in South Korea, there's a lot of English loanwords because of its involvement with the U.S. And that's changed and then the language has also changed with the political and economic climate of the country. And because of this, it caused a lot of issues with communication between the hockey teams. So when looking at the unification as a whole, many people see North Korea, the Korean Peninsula has been separated for so long, and countries have been segregated to the point where the language has changed. That's become a big problem because when people come into the country from North Korea when they're defectors, there's a very blatant language barrier that both people need to work through, and like everyone communicating with that North Korean will have to go through. So if you were to do that on like a large scale, and completely immerse the North Koreans and South Koreans together using one language, there become a lot of language issues and language barriers where people wouldn't quite understand what was going on or what we talk about. So the third source is the Korean Peace Fund by Shepard Iverson. The methods were not polling because they were trying to incentivize to the Korean government and elite what they would want coming in if they were going to agree with North and South Korean reunification. So they mainly conducted this by establishing like the main incentives and major pitfalls of this type of project, and then researching different ways to fund this project. So they found that private wealth, personal safety and freedom, and final honor and prestige are all very important to like the North Korean government elite. However, the program would not be funded by the South Korean people, but by external sources. Now, this would be a major issue and pitfall when it comes to this type of source because it's a way of pushing reunification on the Korean people, even if they don't actually want to reunify. This could cause a lot of tensions elsewhere because if you are pushing to reunify and then completely abandoning the situation, you're leaving the South Koreans to kind of pick up what was going on, incorporate the North Koreans into South Korean daily life and learn their customs and courtesies. You're just kind of breaking down that wall, essentially, which is not necessarily a good thing. So the fourth source is South Korean Youth Perceptions of North Korea and Unification by Chi-yoon Kim, Kil-dong Kim, and Chung Ko-kang. So the methods that this survey was conducted was polls conducted on the general public of South Korea. These were conducted after 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, and they were conducted to find the general public's thoughts, not specifically just the youth. So with their findings, they found that the oldest and the youngest share the most similar opinions. The younger generation was upset by the combination of the women's hockey team, and that most people in their 20s see North Korea as a stranger or an enemy rather than a friend. So from what the pattern kind of shows in this survey specifically, and we're going to look at the charts and things in a minute, was that the oldest and the oldest being people that were alive during the Korean War, and then the youngest being now, they show that with each kind of generation past the Korean War, it kind of got more and more friendly towards the North Koreans, and then it kind of took a turn, and now we're kind of back at not necessarily being super friendly with um, the North Koreans. So imagine it kind of looking like this, where the tensions are very big, and then they kind of take a sharp decrease, and then they come up again because now all of these people that are in their 20s don't really know what it was like before um, the Korean War when it was a unified country, whereas the people who were alive during the Korean War and before kind of know, but were turned off during the Korean War. So these are the charts taken directly from the previous survey, thoughts on reunification. So looking at these charts, table 1 likelihood of war, you can see that the people in their 20s and the people above 60 all show the same kind of idea of likelihood, and it decreases with the people in the 40s. So it did that kind of sloping thing and then went back to what it was before. Again here, negative attitudes towards North Korean economic aid. People in their 20s, people above their 60s, they're the ones least likely to want to support the North Korean economy and help them out because they see themselves more as separate entities, whereas people kind of in that middle of that range are more willing to kind of help people out. In table 3, we're looking at the indifference of reunification, and the people who are younger tend to care more about reunification, not necessarily wanting reunification, but they're more put off by the idea because it would have such drastic effects on their daily lives. Whereas people above 60 don't really care. It's not going to affect them all that much. And then people, all generally in all of the age ranges, preferred um, pace of reunification depended on the circumstances. And the next highest section was no rush. So they're not necessarily trying to reunify anytime soon versus what seems to be the general idea of people globally. So we're going to look at another set of charts and things from that previous survey. So the first two we're going to look at are these two. These are the perception of North Korea. Like, are they seen as one of us, as a neighbor, stranger? Just don't care. It's the same thing over here. So first we're going to look at by each administration. So during the Lee administration, for the most part, there was a drastic change. In 2011, they still mainly saw each other, like each country as like one of us. We're all Korean. And that tended to stay the trend. It kind of fluctuated a little bit, but for the most part, even during the Park administration and the beginning of the Moon administration, they all tended to stay thinking that the North Koreans were one of us. However, if we look at a different chart, this is the perception of North Koreans by age. It kind of tells a different story. So anyone above 60, they're pretty much believing that they're one of us, a neighbor. They grew up knowing people, like especially if they're near border towns, they knew people in North Korea. They see them as friends. A lot of people still have family in North Korea and they're separated. However, this number kind of decreases, except for looking at people in their 40s. For the most part, it decreases until we look at people in their 20s, and they predominantly see North Korea as a stranger and enemy, which is a lot different than what people in their 60s believe. And then this last chart is kind of expected benefits of reunification by age. And for the most part, everyone believes that the main benefit would be lowering the threat of war, not necessarily restoring unity in the identity of Korean people or like alleviating suffering of separating families. It's for the most part just fear of war that people are looking for reunification for. Okay, so the final survey or study is Resettling in South Korea Challenges for Young North Korean Refugees by Ji Young-sung and Yong-hon Hyun-go. So the methods that this study were conducted in, they studied young North Korean refugees living in South Korea, and they researched how re-education programs work for the North Korean refugees to see how effective they are. So from what they found, North Koreans are expected to integrate into South Korean society and culture very quickly. However, this is not necessarily the case, as seen from one of the previous surveys about the language. They have a completely different way of speaking. It's harder to kind of integrate in that kind of sense. And it's hardest for children and young adults to settle into South Korea because of the cultural differences that they grew up with. So there are a number of re-education programs in South Korea to kind of bring the North Koreans into their culture and society. However, they're not as effective as most people thought. And the employment rates and high school dropout rates of North Koreans are still a problem in the community and country. So based on all of the surveys and studies we just looked at and the background information, Kim's study on the perception of North Korea in the eyes of South Korean youth is the most useful source for the research that I was planning on conducting. However, the other sources do provide insight into other important parts of Korean reunification, like the language barrier and the economy, and then what would happen when the North Koreans were to be brought into South Korea. So overall, all of these are very, very important to look at and consider when looking at reunification and just ideas of reunification to make an educated opinion. And then these are the sources. Again, they're all listed with the proper citation.